Alrighty. Ephesians chapter 6, verses 1 through 9. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with the promise that it may be well with you and you will live a long time on earth. Fathers, do not make your children angry, but nurture them in the training and admonition of the Lord. Slaves, obey your masters according to the flesh, with fear and trembling and singleness of heart, as to Christ, not by way of eye service as men pleasers, but as slaves of Christ, who do the will of God from the soul, who do service with good will, as to the Lord and not to men, knowing that each will receive whatever good things he does from the Lord, whether as slaves or freemen. And masters, do the same to them, forbearing threatening, knowing that both their and your Lord is in the heavens, and there is no respect of persons with him. My exegetical idea is, in all relationships, we should love and respect each other as unto the Lord. I say in all relationships because in this relationship as employer to employees, in this relationship to family members, parents to children, there is also up above husbands and wives relationship. The husband and wife relationship, which precedes this in Ephesians chapter 5, the husbands were to love their wives as Christ loves the church. And the wives were to submit to their husbands as the church submits to Christ. So this, between the husband and wives, the family, and in the workplace, we have these relationships that we should love and respect one another. Now, the word love is not used here in relationship to children and fathers and slaves and masters, but it's a part of the relationship paradigm, if we see all of the context, that as imitators of Christ, we should do unto others, the golden rule that we're going to see here in our text. Doing unto others as we would have them do unto us. Doing as unto Christ. In this case, 4 times it says that the slaves were to respect those over them, their masters. But likewise, masters were to not be overbearing and threatening. As to the Lord, the fact that the Lord, who is in the heavens, sees. Let me put this here. He has an eye. He's watching. He sees, and he sees our hearts. He sees our hearts. Eye on us, watching. This is insinuated in the Lord is in the heavens, and there is no respect of persons with him. The Lord sees how we act. He sees the heart of the slave as well. He's watching as well. Up here, the relationship between the children and the parents. The children are to obey as unto the Lord, in the Lord. This is modifying their obedience. Children are to obey in the Lord because as believers, they look to them and respect them and love them. Parents as well love their children, and so just as they have been loved by Christ and been raised up and disciplined by him, therefore, do not make your children, do not embitter your children, make them angry, but nurture them in the training and admonition of the Lord. So we see, first of all, that the manner in which we, for lack of a better word, relate to one another in these relationships, husbands and wives up above, is out of love, is like the Lord Jesus, as if he was right there with us, watching us, as if he was our example, as if we were doing it to honor and glorify him. That is the manner of love and respect that we should give one another. Now, once again, the word love is not here. The word is obey. But it's insinuated in this familial, parental family relationship that this obedience is out of love as unto the Lord. And likewise, fathers, you love your children naturally, and you are parents, mother and fathers, you love your children, and therefore you want to raise them up in the Lord to know what is right and to do it. Whereas in the relationship between slaves and masters, we see this understood now in the 21st century as employers, employees at work. Employer, employee type relationship. So there is a respect and there's an honoring of those over you as unto the Lord, as slaves, so that, or as owners, as someone over the employee, as unto the Lord as well. So this is an idea of respect. So I use both words. We should love and respect each other as unto the Lord. Now this as unto the Lord is captured here. Husbands and wives, as Christ loves the church. Children and parents have this respect and love for one another in the Lord. He is Lord of their lives and their relationships, and they glorify one another, glorify the Lord in their love for one another and obedience to one another. Same thing with obeying and respecting those over you is unto the Lord. So that's how I came up with my exegetical idea. In all relationships, we should love and respect each other as unto the Lord. So then we want to break it down. Let me take a few minutes and break this down so that we can see a little bit more clearly just a few things that might be helpful. All right. Up above, children, obey your parents in the Lord. This word obedience is used for both children and for slaves, those who are subservient to those over them, being the fathers and the masters. Obedience is a different word than love, but yet you show your subservience and your submission and your humility, which are all attributes of love, just as the husband loves the wife as Christ loves the church. There's a sense of subservience for their best interest in this. So in obedience, you're given commands in what to do, but you obey not only to make life easy, but to honor those who are above you in the Lord, so to speak, or even if they are not believers, to win them over by your actions. So obedience is right. Now, Paul in his text explains what is right, or why is it right? Why is it right? And he gives this Old Testament text, which is in Deuteronomy 5:16, as well as in Exodus 20:12. In Exodus 20:12, he only gives one part of it, and you will live long in the earth. But in Deuteronomy, he says both, that it may be well with you, and you will live long. This is the reason why you should honor your father and your mother. All right, one of the fifth of the 10 commandments. Okay, the fifth commandment. One thing we need to keep in mind here is that the commandments were given to Israel as guidelines, moral guidelines, not only to live, but to honor and glorify God, who is their king, who lives in their midst, whom they have fellowship with. You obey his word to show that you are his people, kind of like Adam and Eve were to obey God's commands to show that they were his people. He gave them the opportunity to eat from the tree of life or from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. One would be out of obedience and one would be out of disobedience, with consequences or blessings and curses to both. Likewise, the same here. This to show that you are one of God's people, that you are in the Lord. This is how and why. This is the reason why you children should obey. Okay, the ground or the reason, you have to keep in mind, the reason, that's what a ground is, the foundation for what you do, for obedience, is the Old Testament law. That was a guide. Now, when Paul quotes this, the Old Testament, which he often does in Ephesians as well as in other books, it's a summary statement. The principle, the point of what he's taken from that text is to be applied as the reasoning or the support for what he is giving us. It's taking the Old Testament and showing how it is still applicable to our lives today. Jesus did not come to abrogate the law, but to fulfill it. When it says in Matthew chapter 5, verse 17, that nothing shall pass away. In fact, he says here, do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. I tell you that the truth, until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter, the least stroke of a pen will by any means disappear from the law until everything is accomplished. So the idea here is that the law is still applicable to us. The principle of the law is still applicable, and Paul is using that principle, honor your father and mother, as a support for why we should obey them. Now, it's not that you will receive the blessings like Israelites would enter into the land. You obey me, was the Ten Commandments, and I will deliver you into land. That was the promise. Prosperity and health. Health and well-being was the promise for those who obey him. Deuteronomy chapter 4, verses 1 and 2. Obey my words and you will go into the land. The blessing of obedience is not only a right relationship to your parents, a loving relationship manifested in your parents, but God is glorified in that relationship by your obedience. Likewise, parents are obligated to not embitter, is what it says in the English translation in Colossians. Do not embitter your children, but nurture them in the training and admonition of the Lord. Nurture them, nourish them, like husbands are to do their wives. That same type of language. All right, so it's a negative, positive, and the relationship is, I would just say, a family relationship. What type of relationship is this? It's a family. There's really no other way to describe children to parents. I guess you could say it would be subordinate, but in a relationship, we're just going to say it's a familial relationship. Parents, in Proverbs 22, verse 6, are called to, it says here in the NIV, train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not return from it. In the Hebrew, it actually has train up a child in his own way, and when he is old, he will not return from it. So that in the interpretation, the NIV has made it positive rather than negative. Positive as in the way he should act. Train up a child in the way he should act. But in the Hebrew, it says train up a child in his own way. That is, what is his own way? His own way is in sin. So allow a children to have his own way, to be selfish and to be rotten, is going to create a spoiled brat. So the parents are to understand that their responsibility is to guide and direct, to form and to shape, to discipline a child, that he should not serve himself, but positively speaking, he should be pressed into a framework of obedience to the Lord, and he will not turn from it. Establish him on the rock, so to speak. Establish him in the way. Turn him. If we think of investiture as after having been saved, now we take off or put off the old man and put on the new man, be clothed in the righteousness of Christ. Act this way. Don't act this way, but now act this way. Paul says in Romans 6, you used to offer yourself as slaves in sin, as slaves in sin to the old nature. Now as slaves to righteousness, offer yourselves to Christ. This is reflective in the manner in which we train up our children, not in the way of the world, not according to the flesh, but we train them to walk in Christ's footsteps, to be like him, to glorify him in the Lord. Okay, so this aspect of discipline the question needs to be asked: what is the difference between discipline and punishment? So we had that conversation. You don't want discipline. Hebrews chapter 12 says, endure hardship and discipline. God is treating you as sons. For what son is not disciplined by his father? If you are not disciplined, then you are illegitimate children and not true sons. Goes on, God disciplines us for our own good, that we may share in his holiness. No discipline seems pleasant at the time, but painful later on. It produces a harvest of righteousness and peace for those who have been trained by it. So this training and discipline have a relationship, and this admonition and instruction have a relationship, and this idea of nurture and bringing up have a relationship. I have this little parenthesis here, bringing them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. That's what the RSV, ESV, New American Standard Bible interpret it. This nurturing them in the training and admonition of the Lord is more of a literal translation. But either way, both are trying to capture the idea of the responsibility of parents to nourish, to nurture, to guide in our training, according to the Word of God, in the admonition of the Lord. So parents have this responsibility not to embitter them and push them away, not to be overbearing, but in love, in light of Christ's love for us, to raise up our children. Now, slaves have been called to do the same thing. Slaves are called to obey their masters according to the flesh with fear and trembling and singleness of heart, as to Christ, okay? Not by way of eye service as men pleasers. That sounds kind of like Matthew 6, where you had the scribes and the Pharisees doing their acts of righteousness for everyone to see, whether it be fasting, prayer, and giving. The motive was the key. All right. So in singleness of heart, God who sees the heart as to Christ, not by way of eye service, but as slaves of Christ. Once again, Romans 6, 17 and 18 talks about how we were once slaves to sin, but now we are slaves of Christ. Either way, Bob Dylan said, you got to serve somebody. It may be the devil, it may be the Lord, but you got to serve somebody. Either way, you're a slave. And so now, as a slave of Christ, you are going to honor God with your obedience to those who are over you in the Lord, with a right heart. This word soul, sukos, has to do with having goodwill, having a right heart. Once again, talking about the motive of our actions. Now that our eyes have been opened to see that the Lord is watching us, He sees us, He knows our hearts. We know that the extent of His love, that Christ gave Himself up for us. Therefore, we in turn respond to those to honor and glorify the Lord, knowing, as well as an alternative motive, knowing that each man will receive whatever good things he does from the Lord, whether it's a slave or free. So this is reflective of the slaves of Christ who do the will of God, who do the service of goodwill. This is the positive. This is not by way of us, but as slaves of Christ. This is as well in relationship to this, knowing, we know based upon, as slaves of Christ, that we're going to honor, we will receive whatever good. We know that. So this goes up to slaves, obedience. And this is, you obey, and this is more explicitly telling us the motive, what is hidden in our obedience. So you could put this as a ground, the reason for our obedience. Okay? And now in relationship to masters, masters do the same to them. They are supposed to honor the Lord who sees all in the manner in which they rule over, guide, direct, instruct those under them. Now, we don't have slaves and masters in the 21st century, but all the way up to the 19th century and mid-1800s, before the Civil War, there was. I guess you could say in the 21st century there is, in many ways, a political servitude, slavery. You have those who are using government to oppress and to control those underneath them, and they see these politicians, these people over us, see those whom they represent as lesser than them, maybe for power's sake or for monetary influence, for whatever reason. Oftentimes politicians look down upon those whom they represent and try to control them. It's about money. It's about power and control. So in many ways, even though we don't have slavery outright in this type of relationship, we do have a political slavery in another sense. But in this context, we see it that it's past, and we're looking at it as a work relationship, an employee to the employer relationship. So the master, the employer, knowing that both there and the Lord is in the heavens, who sees, who's watching, who has an eye on them, and that for him there's no respect of persons with the Lord. So everyone is going to be judged for what he has done. Do the same thing. This kind of reflects a golden rule do unto others as you would have them do to you. Do the same things to them that you would have them do to you, which is a good rule, the golden rule, and how to treat others. If you reverse the positions, would it be fair for you to treat them? Would you be as gracious? Would they be as gracious to you as you are to them? So don't be overbearing in your being over somebody in your business situation. This relationship is a ground to this. So masters, do the same thing, knowing, and this is the reason why you do the same things to them that you would have them do to you. And this relationship, once again, would be, I'd say, work. And then between the two of these, we would just call these a series, because this would be connected all the way up with the husband and wives as well. So in this husbands and wives, parents to children, family, employer to employee at work, in all these House of Felton or household texts, these are called the household texts, you should respect one another and love one another as unto the Lord.